What's up guys, my name is Ace and welcome back to the Versus series. This is the series where I take two similar elements from a Call of Duty game, put them side by side, take a deep look at their stats to find out which one is better. In today's episode, we're going to be covering two kill streaks that are actually worth the exact same amount. This is the Cluster Strike and the Precision Airstrike. Now both of these, alongside the cruise missile, are a 5 kill streak, and these two have a lot in common. With both of these, unlike the cruise missile, you have to actually get a line of sight on a point, and then you have to select the point where you want to call that in using a laser pointer for the Cluster Strike and a spotting scope for the Precision Airstrike. So let's first have a look at the timings of this. Now, something that's important with a streak like this is how long does it take for that streak to come in once you've actually selected that location, because the longer that delay is, the more likely things will be changing and you'll just straight up miss your enemy. For the Cluster Strike, from the moment you select to call it in to the moment that first cluster hits the ground is 5.6 seconds. Whereas with the Precision Airstrike, this delay is 6 seconds. So they're actually very similar in this area. The cluster does come in about 400 milliseconds faster, so I guess you could say it has a slight edge there, but realistically speaking, they're pretty much the same in this area. Another timing is how long does their damage effects last within the area you're calling it in. With the Cluster Strike, you actually get 6 clusters that hit the ground. From the moment that first cluster goes off to the moment the last cluster goes off, this takes a total of 10 seconds. So this means as an area of denial tool, the Cluster Strike is great because it effectively shuts down that entire area for 10 full seconds. Whereas with the Precision Airstrike, the Airstrike will get 2 passes. And the total time that these passes are dealing damage is just 4.5 seconds, so less than half the amount of time that the Cluster Strike is lasting for, and therefore as an area of denial tool, the Cluster Strike is by far the superior option. So in ground war, for instance, where you have those really big capture areas, if you want to lock that down for as long as possible and keep those enemies off of that, the Cluster Strike is going to be the better bet. Same thing goes with like hardpoint, for instance. The Cluster Strike is great for keeping the enemies off there for a decent amount of time. So those are the timings you need to know with these streaks, and that's quite important to know. However, the next thing, and possibly the most important thing that you guys are here for, is the damage radius of these two streaks. How big of an area do they actually cover and kill enemies within? So let's start off with the Cluster Strike, and the Cluster Strike's kind of interesting, and the direction that you call the Cluster Strike in from is actually significant. Now the way this works is, let's just say you're calling in the Cluster Strike from this direction at this exact point right here. The individual clusters will hit within a small area around this circle. Like, it's not going to land perfectly on that circle. There is a small radius around that where the clusters will hit. But then after the cluster explodes, it will deal damage forward from that point. So this goes to show that it is important which direction you're calling the cluster in on. And also it does go to show that if there's a wall after that point where you call that in, it will actually block that cluster damage as it's trying to move forward. So that's another thing to point out. If you call it on one side of a wall, for instance, don't expect that damage to carry over to the other side of the wall unless you happen to get lucky and one of the individual missiles lands on the other side of the wall, which you can't really rely on because the clusters land in pretty much the same spot every time. Now, as far as measuring this total damage range here, the total range of this damage extends out to about 12 to 15 meters based on my testing. Keeping in mind that this isn't 100% perfect testing because I am just looking at animations here, it's very difficult to test this with perfect accuracy, and that cluster after the initial explosion does extend out in a cone. Now, as for the Precision Airstrike, when you mark a point with this, that is going to be the center of your damage lane. Now, when it comes to direction, the game tries to choose the best direction that that's going to come in from, so it's going to avoid being obstructed as much as possible. And based on my testing, I tried to put myself in situations where I could kind of control or predict the direction the aircraft's going to come in at, and I just can't reliably do that. So, in a realistic situation, you can't really worry too much about the direction it's going to come in at. You just kind of have to mark a good center point for that, so whichever direction it decides to come in at, it will still deal some damage to people. Now, as far as the damage range on this one, as far as I could tell, it looks like we get a really long rectangular damage profile. So the total length of this damage range on the pass is roughly 30 meters or so, which is pretty respectable. That covers a pretty good area. However, the width isn't all that great. It's only about 7.5 meters. So this means with the Precision Airstrike, sometimes you just get unlucky and the aircraft comes from a strange angle that makes it so you don't really kill nearly as many people as you could. And then other times you get really lucky and you just get a bunch of enemies that are in a big row within that 30-meter range, and it just takes everybody out. So you can see when we compare their damage ranges of the Cluster Strike and the Precision Airstrike, they each have their pros and cons. I would say the Cluster is a lot more controllable, but the Precision Airstrike has a lot of potential to deal really concentrated damage over an area. And that's another thing I wanted to mention with these, is the amount of damage that they're dealing. Now this one is based on more so personal experience rather than super careful testing. But in my experience with clusters, if I'm using EOD, I can sometimes survive an explosion from a cluster. As long as I'm not like right in the middle of those clusters. I have frequently survived situations where a cluster has gone off fairly close to me and dealt damage to me. I can't say the same thing about Precision Airstrikes though. As far as I remember, anytime a Precision Airstrike has dealt damage to me, I'm guaranteed to be dead, and I use EOD basically all the time. So that is another thing to be aware of. With the clusters, I tend to find that I will get hit markers on people that are using EOD, whereas that just doesn't happen with the Precision Airstrike. And this leads me to the next thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to survivability against these streaks. An enemy cluster strike is very easy to pinpoint on the minimap after you see that first cluster land, and therefore it's quite easy to avoid a cluster strike that's currently being called in. As long as that first one didn't hit you already, it's pretty easy to tell where that is and just stay out of that area to survive. When it comes to the Precision Airstrike though, you can still see the plane on the minimap, and you can kind of tell the direction that it's coming from, but it is practically impossible to tell exactly where that airstrike is about to deal damage. And this makes it much more difficult to avoid and survive a Precision Airstrike if it's called in your general vicinity. So that's just another area where I would say the Airstrike is a little bit better with raw killing potential, whereas like I said earlier, the Cluster is more of an area of denial sort of a streak. Additionally, something I have found in my testing here is most of the buildings in the game, or at least a lot of the buildings in this game, they've designed them to have even just really small holes in the roof. And what I've found with this is with a Precision Airstrike, if I aim my pointer inside that building and call that Precision Airstrike in, there's a very good chance I'm going to kill anybody that's inside the room that has that open rooftop. Now the reason for that is it seems like it just deals really concentrated damage. You don't have to get an individual cluster to just happen to thread the needle and make it through that hole. It just deals very concentrated damage within that area, and therefore it's really likely that that damage will pass through that small hole in the roof and kill anybody inside. With the cluster, on the other hand, the actual cluster itself has to thread the needle and go through that small hole in the roof, and therefore I found it is still possible that you might get lucky and get a cluster going inside a building, but the Precision Airstrike is far more consistent and effective at clearing out buildings, assuming there is a hole in the roof, which like I said, a lot of the buildings in the game will have holes in the roof. Now one last factor to mention between these two streaks that isn't super important, but it is worth mentioning, is just how accurate you can call these in. With the Cluster Strike, like I said at the beginning, you have that laser pointer to mark the spot that you want to see, and you can kind of aim down sight to zoom in a little bit, which will help you pinpoint the location. But especially at longer ranges, it can be really hard to see exactly where the center of your screen is and exactly where that laser is hitting. Whereas with the Precision Airstrike, you've actually got that spotting scope, and you can be a lot more precise with where you're placing that marker when calling the streak in. So this is an area that's not the most important out of what we talked about today, but it is still something to consider, and the Precision Airstrike definitely has the edge here. But with that, I'm pretty sure I've covered all of the important points to talk about in today's video. As for the overall verdict on this, I really think these are both pretty good 5 kill streaks. And like you've seen, they each have their pros and cons. So overall, if I'm playing a game mode like Hardpoint for instance, I'm almost definitely going to choose the Cluster Strike because of that area of denial ability, where I can just call it directly on a nice open hardpoint for instance, and now the enemy players basically can't touch that hardpoint for the next 10 seconds. If I'm going for raw killing potential though, I think I lean a little bit more towards the Precision Airstrike. I find with this, I can be a lot more precise. It's a lot harder for the enemies to detect where this is coming in from and therefore avoid damage from it. And on top of that, it's better at taking people out that are inside buildings or have a little bit of overhead cover. So if I'm going more for that killing role, I will lean towards that Precision Airstrike. But of course, those are just my opinions based on the testing as well as my experience with these two streaks. I'd like to know in the comment section below, between the Cluster Strike and the Precision Airstrike, which one do you think is better? Which one do you use more often and why? Also, if you guys missed the first episode of Versus for Modern Warfare, I covered the Thermite versus the Molotov. I will leave a link to the playlist down below, and I'm always open to suggestions for other similar elements you'd like me to compare for the Versus series. Keeping in mind, I'm not doing weapons yet. I will be doing weapons after I finish all my gun guides. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.